Dr. Seuss may just be one of the most famous children's book writers of all time, to the point that many would argue that he was the one who set the standard for fun, whimsical tales that made children love to read and maybe even learn a lesson or two. But as many a terrible adaptation has proved, his brand of whimsy doesn't exactly translate itself too well to live action films, and even animation can be pretty hit or miss. But what many don't know about the famous author was that, long before any of his books got movie adaptations, the man himself actually took a crack at screenwriting and co-wrote a movie with a man named Alan Scott, though it's generally agreed that Dr. Seuss was the real creative force behind the film. Only his experience making it proved to be such an unpleasant one that he never attempted it again and stuck only to children's books and the occasional animated adaptation of them after that, causing it to be the only movie ever written by Dr. Seuss. And today, I'd like to go over this movie as well as the production surrounding it and discuss whether or not the final product is worthy of the man who wrote it. And there will be spoilers for the movie in question ahead. So if you'd like to see it for yourself and don't want to know what happens, you should turn off this video and come back after you have seen it. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay. So the movie in question here, with the distinction of being the only one written by Dr. Seuss, would be the 1953 film The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, telling the story of a boy named Bart who's forced to take piano lessons by his widowed mother, having a nightmare about his piano teacher being a diabolical villain who plans to make him, as well as 499 other unlucky boys, practice piano forever, with his only hope being the family plumber he's taken a liking to. This movie is definitely weird. But to give Dr. Seuss his due credit, it does perfectly capture the mind of a child. Because from the perspective of any adult watching, Dr. Terwilliger is simply a stressed, overly ambitious man who takes his craft a bit too seriously. But to a kid who hates playing the piano, he's his mortal enemy and a pure evil villain. So that's exactly what he becomes in his dream. An evil, scheming, conniving, over-the-top, hammy villain who nonetheless also comes across as campy and pathetic due to the boy's hatred of him. And his only goal is to make children suffer by playing the piano. And in the same vein, Bart loves his mother, as he freely admits, but because she insists he listen to Dr. Terwilliger and take piano lessons in the first place, his only way to rationalize it is that he has her under some kind of spell. And once again, that's exactly the way it is in his dream. She's his number one assistant only because he's hypnotized her into doing his bidding, and he alone can save his mother from him. And finally, being fatherless himself, Bart rejects his intended father figure in Dr. Terwilliger due to his harsh and unpleasant nature, and instead looks up to and admires the family plumber because he's much more fun and nice to be around. So as a result, in his dream, he becomes the one adult who can help him save his mother and stop Dr. T, as well as proves to be exceptionally gifted in several areas. But being an adult, Bart still has to work hard to convince him of what's really going on. The point here is, Dr. Seuss had a gift for understanding how children think, and it shows in the writing behind this movie. Because once again, From the perspective of an adult, Bart's simply a kid with a wild imagination who can't stand taking piano lessons or his teacher. But Dr. Seuss brilliantly shows that from his perspective, it's the most serious crisis on Earth. And once he starts dreaming, perfectly translates all the characters involved to show how they are, from his point of view, completely unfiltered. And as I got into in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, that's the best way for the audience to understand Bart's mindset. So as I said before, a strict piano teacher becomes a tyrannical, cartoonishly pure evil villain. A stressed mother trying to do right by her son becomes a brainwashed tool for said villain that must be saved. And a friendly plumber just doing his job suddenly becomes a reluctant hero. And if you were a kid with any kind of imagination, you'll know that this is a more accurate picture of how children see the adults and the roles they play in their lives than most would like to admit. His dream even ends with him defeating Dr. Terwilliger using a noise remover, only for him to wake up and realize that he didn't actually accomplish anything and that he's still stuck exactly where he was before. And again, to most children, that's a very relatable childhood feeling. Though, for what it's worth, the ending does imply that Bart's problems might be solved in a slightly more realistic fashion. But even apart from the characters themselves, this movie takes full advantage of the fact that most of it is a dream to invoke a lot of classic Dr. Seuss imagery. And it's a lot more unsettling than you'd expect, but befitting the feeling of a nightmare. A lot of the set designs are pretty dark and ominous, which does make sense considering the dream takes place in a prison, and even gets downright bizarre in a couple of places. But the best example for that I can give has to be the ladder scene. Being chased by Dr. Terwilliger's guards, Bart tries to escape by climbing up a huge ladder, only for it to lead to nowhere. But not to be deterred, he simply climbs to the top and then jumps, using his shirt as a parachute. And not only does the imagery in this scene just scream Dr. Seuss, particularly in the design of the ladder and the shirt, but also captures the feeling of dream logic very well. And there are many other examples of that throughout the movie as well, including an almost 7-minute ballet by Dr. Terwilliger's prisoners who play instruments other than the piano, and quite a few other random things that pop up for seemingly no reason. Though, granted, some of that came down to the fact that the movie was recut and edited in post-production, but it still fits the atmosphere of a bizarre dream very well. And there's also the songs, approximately 8 in total, but in the original cut was actually closer to 20. And with the lyrics to all of them written by Dr. Seuss himself, they do actually prove to be pretty good, and maybe even a little catchy. And as I just touched on, there's even a few dance sequences without any words as well, and they aren't bad ones either. To put it simply, it's pretty obvious that Dr. Seuss had some pretty big ambitions when he wrote this movie, only it didn't exactly turn out the way he wanted it, to the point that he said the final cut was unrecognizable from his intended vision. And this mainly came down to the fact that test audiences hated his version of the film, and since it had proven to be very expensive to make, both producer Stanley Kramer and Columbia were anxious for it to make a profit, so they reshot and edited the film until, as I just said, Dr. Seuss felt it had been twisted beyond recognition. And this recut is why certain things in the film seem a little confusing, such as some of the musical numbers and dance sequences being added or changed around, making them seem a little out of place, or random things or events popping up without any explanation. But perhaps the most glaring example of this is the unexplained presence of twin guards conjoined together by a long beard riding around on roller skates. In the theatrical cut of the film, they're seemingly there for no reason other than because it's a boy's dream and it's weird, as well as get an equally absurd death scene when their beard is cut. But in the original version of the movie, it was explained that these two characters were actually Bart's twin uncles who were great and respected pianists that his mother wants him to live up to, hence their presence in his dream. They were even supposed to get their own musical number, but it all ended up being cut, leaving their presence in the finished film totally random and unexplained, apart from a picture of them on Bart's piano. Now once again, considering the setting is a child's dream, the fact that there's no context behind their presence is acceptable, and even adds to their creep factor. But that alone does paint a pretty good picture of just how much the movie was retooled in post-production. But in the end, it all proved to be for naught, as critics and audiences hated the released version as well, to the point that people started walking out of the preview 15 minutes in, and by the end, only one boy was left simply because he had to wait for his mother to pick him up. Critics tore the movie to shreds, and the movie bombed at the box office due to its bizarre nature, causing pretty much everyone involved to distance themselves from it, but none more than Dr. Seuss himself. Again, he was already pretty upset that they retooled his version, which today is considered lost, but the fact that it was so universally rejected only made him feel worse about it. He refused to ever discuss the film again, and it killed any chance of him ever attempting to write another movie. And considering how much the final product ended up deviating from what he had originally had in mind, and how reviled it was, who can really blame him? But that being said, modern reviewers tend to view the movie in a more positive light, praising its absurd nature and tone, visual effects, performances, and songs. Some even credit it with being the precursor to other children's films such as Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which it does admittedly have a similar feel to. In fact, some even believe that this movie was a major inspiration for Matt Groening when he was making The Simpsons, specifically that there's a boy named Bart and his dynamic with Sideshow Bob, who is said to actually share quite a few traits with Dr. Terwilliger. And director Joe Dante is notably a big fan of it. So while universally hated in its time, these days the movie is considered a minor cult classic that was released before audiences were ready for such a bizarre experience. But the question must still be asked, is the final product actually that good, especially for being the only movie written by Dr. Seuss? And the first thing I'd have to point out is that Dr. Seuss's original version is believed to be lost, and thus we'll never know if that cut was better than the one that everybody knows today. But even when looking at the version we do have, and trying to be as objective as possible, I would say it's not that bad, and maybe even pretty good, as long as one is willing to look at it through the eyes of a child. So if one doesn't like children or family films, then they definitely aren't going to like this. Because as I went on at length about before, this is a movie that speaks to the kid in everybody. It actually shows how kids view their problems and see everything not only through a lens of exaggeration, but as a much bigger deal than it actually is. And as I just noted, It carries an air of childhood similar to classic musicals like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang or Willy Wonka, but in a slightly more unsettling way because most of the film is set in a nightmare. But the point is, it's not a bad movie, just that the people those kinds of films do appeal to are the ones most likely to enjoy it, in addition to Dr. Seuss fans, as well as those with a love of absurdism and music, ironically enough. But either way, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is a very interesting movie for several different reasons. Whether for its extremely bizarre nature and imagery, to the way it captures the mindset of children, to its troubled production, to the way its reception has evolved over time, to being the only movie to ever be written by Dr. Seuss, one word that certainly can't be associated with this movie is boring. But at the same time, considering how much it was apparently changed from what Dr. Seuss wanted it to be, along with countless other factors, it makes the final product one that's appeal is likely to vary wildly from person to person. Though once again, a major reason for its initial reception had to come down to the fact that audiences simply weren't ready for such a bizarre children's film. And since that's become a more popular subgenre over time, it's a lot easier to appreciate it now for those qualities. But if nothing else, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T will always be known for being the only movie to actually be written for the screen by Dr. Seuss. So if nothing else, there is that, I guess. Though it is a shame that the production had to go the way it did, because who knows what kind of movies Dr. Seuss may have been able to write further down the line, once special effects got a little better and cheaper. Though considering what happened here, maybe The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is better off being the only movie with that particular distinction. Okay, I think that was everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T deserves the distinction of being the only movie written by the legendary Dr. Seuss? Or do you agree with him and think that it was nothing but a waste of time? Or had you never even heard of it before you watched this video? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please note that you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed here, be they mine, the general audience, or Dr. Seuss himself. You can think whatever you'd like about The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, and if you think I got it all wrong, that's perfectly fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.